So I've made a little bit of progress with my Marble Sandbox since the last presentation. And rather than demo each one of these concepts and how to build them, I want to just give you a really kind of high level overview about some of the logic that I'm using here. And just want to cover a few basic updates since the last video presentation. So I've made a couple of custom shapes from Cinema 4D. Just some simple ramps. Whenever there's a cube, I'm using just the standard cube object inside Unity 3D. But for things that needed kind of a more custom shape, I just modeled a couple of different ramps, so I have kind of two different levels happening here. I've also modeled a simple corkscrew type object, and just like the rotating platforms that we demonstrated in a previous demonstration, I just kind of made some real simple, just some real simple state machines that kind of drive a rotation. Now I've chosen to go with the mouse look camera here rather than the fixed view that we presented both of those earlier, just to kind of get a more dynamic view. But all of these concepts would obviously work with either one of the views that you decide to set up. So I got a couple of things working here. I just modified the user control a little bit, and I need to kind of tweak a few things. But I've also made a couple of platforms, and these platforms are going to be generic sort of teleporters and goals and power-ups and that sort of thing. And I'm going to get a lot of leverage out of this basic trigger collider setup. Much like those setups that we looked at in the Adventure Island, each one of these platform objects and including these red cubes that I have here, I've actually labeled these red cubes as lava temporarily to suggest that they'll do some damage. And what the logic is on these cubes is just a simple respawn. It basically just sends back to a spawn point. And so if we come into contact with this lava, I have a simple trigger event, and that trigger event fires off a respawn. Now, in some cases, some of the logic that we'll look at, I have a couple of extra states here, and I'll just share with you a little bit of the logic. I have an idle here that passes through a blink command. And so as we're becoming more familiar with Playmaker and some of the concepts, it's not a bad idea to explore some of the menus to see what kinds of options we have. So we have this blink functionality, and that just turns a game object on or off over an amount of time, a set amount of time, and so we can have this little blink function. So when we come into contact with the lava, currently it's not doing any damage, but what it is doing is blinking and resetting the location of the player. And I'm getting a lot of mileage out of that. So I have a similar mechanic here for the orange and blue little teleport platforms that I've set up here, and it's just the logic here, these little platforms are made up to work with each other. So if I go into the orange platform is just an empty game object, and inside that I have a cylinder. In addition to that, we have a particle system, and the particle system is generating particles that are of the same color. And that's just kind of a little visual cue, something to attract attention, to let the user know that this is a special kind of object. And to generate a particle system, remember, we can go to Game Object, Create Other, and generate a particle system. Once we have the particle system with it selected, we can go play with all of these parameters over here to get the effect that we want. So with a little bit of tinkering, you can create all kinds of effects with the particles. In addition to that, I want to point out that in the standard assets, if you've imported the particle effects, there are some pre-configured particles that you can use, at least, even if you want to just get started with a fire or dust effect and then tweak those particles. Those options are available in standard assets. And if you don't have those available, you can always go into assets, import package, and import particles. So back to my orange platform. So I have a particle system here just to draw the user's attention. In addition, I have this idea that I may have the particles turned on at some point to let the user know that this is actually an active platform versus something that's turned off. And to reinforce that concept, I have a simple point light here to kind of help show the difference, maybe having power on or power off. So later on, if I decide that I want to toy with some of the concepts of having kind of a puzzle type level where you have to turn on a platform in order to activate it, maybe it's something I can play with, or maybe not, but it's just a little visual effect. Then I have a teleport trigger. The teleport trigger is just a little collider. In this case, I decided to use a sphere. And this collider works in the same way that the lava and the respawn from the previous project worked. We just have a little trigger event here. It's waiting to listen for a trigger. And when the player object runs into that, we just do a get position, set position. Now I have a couple of different, I have a slightly more complex logic here because I wanted to allow these platforms to teleport back and forth between each other. And there was a little bit of a bug that if I have the orange platform teleporting to the blue platform, by default, if we simply do a get and set position, when we move the player over, it actually triggers that same platform to teleport. And so if we have these two linked together, you teleport and just start bouncing back and forth, creating a loop. So a couple of these extra states here are just to kind of correct for that loop. I'm not going to demonstrate the whole concept, but I will point out some of the fundamental concepts here. The initial concept is that we have a trigger event, and when we enter that trigger, we fire off this teleport event. Now I could wire teleport directly over to the teleport action, which does a get position, set position. And again, that looks for just the spawn point of any object that we determine we want to use. I've added in a little bit of a logic check here to where when you get teleported, it sets a bool variable, which is either a true or false, so that once you teleport, it'll mark this variable to let you know that you have been teleported. Okay. And then a little test to see if you are actually still standing on the teleport. And then it kind of sets this bool value to let you know that you actually did just teleport. And the idea here is because I have the same logic attached to the blue platform, the only difference is that when you trigger this teleport device, the location in the case of the blue is the orange teleport spawn, this object over here. And in the orange platform, the target is the blue teleport spawn. So again, there was just I built in a little check here, and it's completely unnecessary. I mean, there's other ways to work around this, but I built in a little teleport check to see if you've just teleported. And if you have just teleported, then you can actually leave the platform, or you won't teleport back and loop back over. You have to leave the platform to reactivate the teleport. So just a little fix that I put in there, that's what's making that logic look a little bit more complicated. But again, a little outside the scope of what I want to demonstrate in this presentation. I will post some screenshots of that logic, so if you want to follow along and try to rebuild something like that, you're welcome to do that. And then I have just this general platform. I made this green platform here, which I've called goal, which has the same concept. It just has a platform object, a particle system, a light, and a trigger collider here that has no logic assigned to it. And I'm probably going to use this to indicate the goal or the end of the level. So I still have this kind of sandbox set up here. So I don't have really a puzzle to solve just yet. I'm just still trying to work out the basic mechanics of my level design here. But this will be the goal that I want to get to. And so just to kind of start testing the concept, I'm going to move this over to a point where I think it would be appropriate to have a goal. I'll just move this over. And I have this lava again, which is just causing the player to respawn. Now, it's not subtracting from health just yet, which is ultimately the goal. Or maybe I'll have a simple life system where you have 3 chances or 3 lives to solve the goal or get to the goal. And if you don't, then the game restarts. But we'll start solving those requirements in later presentations. For now, I just want to look at the basic big picture and continue to set up just some real simple level designs, some real simple kind of sandbox concepts. One of the things that I want to point out is that I have these cube objects. I also have these simple ramp transitions. I'm going to duplicate this object and move it up. So you can see that this is something that I modeled in Cinema 4D. It's just a little transition. And the idea is it transitions from one surface height to, if I duplicate and move this object up 1 meter, and I'll just kind of slide this over. Actually, that must have been 2 meters, yeah. If I move this 2 meters up, well, let me see. I'm snapping, and I'm going to talk a little bit about snapping here in just a minute. Yeah, it's actually a 1 meter snap. Snapping is extremely valuable. And what I mean by snapping is that I can move this object around in kind of the free space, and you can see over here in my Z position, it's moving just kind of, you know, according to that float value. Wherever I drag it, I move it. If I hold down the command key, you'll notice that I'm snapping. So if I hold down the command key before I move this, I'm snapping. It's jumping to degree increments. Okay, now I'm going to delete that. By default, if we go to edit snap settings, your default snap settings are going to be set to 1 meter. Okay, and you'll notice that you have snap scale settings and snap rotation as well. And with the default settings, if I grab a cube object and I use Command D to duplicate it, or I can right click on the object and duplicate it, if I hold down the command key when I move these objects, it's going to snap to 1 degree increments, which is very convenient because what we can do is we could, I'll just move this cube over here, with the Command D to duplicate and then holding down the command key, we can quickly duplicate and snap these tiles together to create a platform, a level, and I can just grab different increments. Because I've modeled these elements based on 1 meter and they're 4 meters square, all of these pieces kind of fit together. So I wasn't just modeling these things kind of arbitrarily, but I was modeling these according to a dimension that I thought would be useful. So they're square. I mean, they don't have to be 1 meter necessarily, but we can really quickly kind of snap these assets together and build something that would be kind of fun and interesting to navigate with our marble. So we can make some ramps and connect these platforms and really kind of create a puzzle to solve. Now, in the previous project, we also looked at moving platforms, where we could do kind of a first-person platformer style. I took those concepts of moving the platform around and sped that up and moved it according to a vertical axis, and I made this little launcher object over here that just kind of launches objects. One's kind of more just pushes you up. The other platform kind of pushes you up and launches you in the air, so I thought that might be kind of a fun mechanic to play with. Now, we could use that same translate function over time that we use to build things like elevators and moving platforms. So don't forget about the stuff that we looked at in previous presentations, to experiment and kind of be creative with our solutions based on what we know and what we can do in Playmaker. Experiment with some of these basic concepts. So when we collide or trigger with objects, if we want to start to collide with objects, now we've looked at triggers for the most part, so that if we interact with an object, we can trigger an event. We also have the ability to use, we have trigger events, which we've used. I'm using that on the lava. But we also have the ability to do collision events. And the difference between a collision event and a trigger event, they can both be found under physics. So rather than doing a trigger event like we were used to with the pickup object, we can do a collision event. And the only difference between a collision event and a trigger event is that we don't set the collider to isTrigger. Okay? We say on collision event, and the suggestion here is that this is a solid object that we can still interact with, that we can move across. Okay, so for example, if I pause this, in our previous game, we would have created a cube, and we would have taken that cube, I'll move that close to the ground, and we would set that cube to a trigger. We would then listen for a trigger event. That trigger event would then fire off an action, and we could do whatever we wanted to do on that state. So if we had a trigger event, in this case that's listening for my player, because I have my player tagged with the player tag here, Okay, so I can filter and listen just for the interaction with that player character. I can then send that event. Now this is the scenario that we used for the pickup cubes and the points, and so now I can pass through that and I can test this and make sure that's something I can pick up and collect, which I've picked it up, or I've crossed it. I can see that it fired off the action down here, or fired off the state, but of course I haven't destroyed that object, so I'm not suggesting any kind of a pickup. If I go back to this object and I turn off is trigger, and I'll just add another action here, I'll say instead of trigger event, I'll do a collision event. I'll do a collision event where I fire off that same action. I'm going to temporarily turn off my trigger event. So we essentially have the same thing. The only difference, now we have a collision event, which will be different than a trigger event, meaning that when I bounce off of this thing, okay, and you can see I'm not actually firing my action, so I have an error. And what I forgot to do was filter based on my tag. When it collides with an object tagged with player, we can fire off this action. So I have a collision event, there we go, which is a little bit different than a trigger event in that we're not passing through the object, but we're colliding with its collider. Now, taking those concepts, I've also added some other simple mechanics to my level, like if I sit on certain platforms for too long, they add a little force that kind of pops you up. Okay, and this concept is the same thing. It's listening to a collision event. Once we get that collision event, I do a little wait action, but then pass it off to a little launch command that applies a really aggressive Y force, not for every frame, just for one frame, which in this case just kind of launches the player up in the air. Again, I have some extra states here, and the logic, according to what I built, is that you're required to wait for a short bit, in this case 2 seconds, before that action happens. So you can actually pass across this this object before you get launched, so you can actually move beyond it pretty quickly. But I thought if there was some kind of timing puzzle that you had to wait for, maybe it'd be kind of fun to start launching the user around if they don't time it right. And I have a little correction here for if you end up not staying on the platform, it doesn't end up launching you inadvertently. So I just do kind of little logic checks along the way, or little bug fixes as I realize that things aren't working the way that I might want them. And then modifying that, I have a similar setup here on this next cube, which instead of launching you straight up in the air, launches you in a specific Z direction. So in this case, it launches us in the negative Z direction, just to kind of throw us off the platform. So obviously, if I had some kind of danger zone here, like the lava, that would kind of ruin my day or ruin my play experience. So these are just some of the basic concepts that I'm playing around with. And I probably won't integrate too many more mechanics into my level, because I think with all the pieces, parts that I have here, I could string together some tiles and create an interesting puzzle. So I'm going to continue to push forward. I will demonstrate some other concepts. In the next presentation, what I'd like to do is start individually solving the individual requirements for this project. So just a reminder that we want to have an introduction screen with a working menu. That's probably going to be the last thing that I do, because I want to use my completed level as the background for my menu screen. So we'll address that as one of the last things that we do. We want to create at least 2 playable levels, so I'll create a couple simple variations on some of the mechanics I have here, making the second level a little bit more complex. I want to include some kind of win condition or objective, and I've already started to factor that in. I just have this goal object here. If I can figure out where I put it, there's my goal, and it looks like I inadvertently turned something off of my goal, so I'll have to get back and see what happened to my platform. I don't know where my platform is. That's okay. There it is. So I moved the platform and not the. Let me just reset that back to its original position. Here, let's try that one more time. Anyway, I'll fix this offline. Back to the requirements. I definitely want to include some kind of win condition. I'm going to use a simple goal that I need to reach in order to successfully complete that level. I need to manage at least 2 resources, and I think the resource that I'm going to manage is I'm definitely going to have some kind of health possibly some kind of life. So maybe I have, 10 points of health or 100% health, and that as I take damage, I reduce that health. And if I reduce that health to 0, maybe I have 2 or 3 lives that I lose lives as I go. So I can only lose 3 lives before the entire game resets. So those might be the 2 resources that I manage. Or maybe I'll build a timer into my level that says that, okay, I got 2 minutes to get across this level. So that's another resource that I'm managing, maybe health and time. But we'll figure that out based on what's the most appropriate for our gameplay. So it's going to be up to you to determine. Or maybe we want to, have some kind of point value, or we're just doing some simple pickups and we're accumulating points. We do want to integrate a simple power-up system, and the example that I'll use is I want the ability to be able to gain the ability to jump and maybe increase my speed or the force at which I'm applying. Or even just one of those things. Maybe I'll go from level 1, halfway through the level, I'll do a simple pickup which gives me the ability to jump. And that would solve that requirement. We'll start talking about simple ways to incorporate sound to make the user experience that much more interesting. And then we'll use these basic concepts that we come up with just to create some kind of simple obstacle or simple puzzle to solve so that the player has a challenge to get through the level. Again, we don't want this to be just a straight simulation of, okay, I can move this marble around this fun sandbox. We want to make it somewhat challenging. And then finally, we want to have a game over screen, so that we want to have on the front end, we want a menu saying, okay, we're ready to play this experience. And then if we lose or aren't successful, or even if we win, we want to have a logical end to our game. We've completed the levels and we were either successful or we were not successful. So those are the requirements we want to integrate into this project. And I'm going to demonstrate each one of those concepts briefly. Just so that you have the knowledge to kind of pull this off. Maybe you already have some ideas based on what we know on how to do this and based on some of the actions that you've discovered inside Playmaker, but I'll demonstrate my solution to each one of those problems. So as you push forward with this stuff, make sure that if you have any questions, you're posting in the discussion board, and also post your works in progress to your discussion board. So as we speak, I'm going to create a build of this, and I'll post that to the discussion board, and we'll catch up in the next presentation.